Right, and up next, we turn to Taiwan for more on the response there to China's latest white paper. I have James Charter live on the line over in Taipei. James, welcome to the program.
Thanks so much for having me.
Right, so James, what more can you tell us about the reaction there in Taiwan with regard to this latest white paper by China?
Well, across the board, whether that's among the public or senior politicians, what we're really seeing is essentially an augmentation or a heightening of concerns or understandings of the cross-strait situation that were really already in existence. This is, of course, the first white paper that we've seen under the leadership of Xi Jinping. Beijing essentially saying that they would rather solve Taiwan-related issues peacefully, but once again, the reiteration that this will be achieved via force if it's necessary. I think that's a recognition on behalf of Beijing that the space that they think for peaceful resolution is really shrinking. Taiwan's official response right from when, Pelosi's visit was first announced until now has been to emphasize that they don't want any type of escalation and will not seek to provoke Beijing in any way. But at the same time saying that they will do everything they can to protect their sovereignty. Again, the broader analyst response, I think is essentially an extension of the type of perspective that we saw prior to Nancy Pelosi's visit as well. That Taiwan, this is especially from security officials, saying that Taiwan really needs to demonstrate to the US and the wider world that it's ready and capable to defend itself should the need arise.
Right, and speaking about Pelosi's trip to Taiwan last week, James, what do pundits there believe was perhaps the purpose of her high-profile presence on the island nation?
Well, of course, Pelosi was very clear right from the outset of her trip why she felt like this was an important point to visit Taiwan. There was an op-ed published in the Washington Post moments after she landed in Taipei, and she expressed this throughout her time in Taiwan, where she said the world essentially faces at the moment a choice between democracy and autocracy, and that the situation in Taiwan is really at an inflection point in terms of Taiwan really being able to defend its democracy. I think the criticism from some in Taiwan, a minor criticism, I think, is essentially asking whether we really were at that turning point or whether Pelosi was, in a sense, manufacturing a turning point herself. Among other Taiwanese observers, there was an expectation, I think, that Pelosi's visit would achieve things, similar to when other foreign delegations visit Taiwan, which is expanding Taiwan's partnerships and democratic partnerships with other countries around the world. Of course, this is the United States, so there is an added significance to this, given the security umbrella that Washington provides to Taiwan. And so I think, there was an anticipation and an expectation and a hope that Pelosi's visit would really demonstrate once more that if an invasion does take place, that the United States would be there to support Taiwan in that eventuality.
Right. James, against that backdrop, some pundits have been questioning the wisdom of Pelosi's trip there, especially amid existing tensions between the US and China on several fronts. Has this particular sentiment been shared by people there?
I think naturally there has been some degree of division on this question. I think there is a greater degree of agreement, however, amongst the public and amongst officials that, regardless of whether Nancy Pelosi had come to Taiwan or not, that the type of intimidation and aggression that we see targeted towards Taiwan from China would have continued nonetheless. This question, in a sense, from the perspective of Beijing, is not really going anywhere. Another point, an interesting point I've noticed in conversations with some Taiwanese people about this trip is that they were more concerned about the way in which news and information about the trip was leaked ahead of time. They essentially say that this created space and time for Beijing to formulate and construct a response that we saw across a number of fronts, across the military front, across the economic front, and across cyberspace as well. I think the full answer to your question in terms of how Taiwanese people really view this type of very high-profile, visits going forward will be, I think time will tell. And I think it really depends on how much Beijing is looking to really apply pressure to Taiwan specifically as a result of this trip. This is, of course, something that Beijing will want to do despite promising that it's the United States that will bear the consequences, because they want to raise the stakes for Taiwanese people themselves. And in a sense, put off Taiwanese people from thinking this type of high-profile visit is even worth it.
Right. James, speaking on a local show following her trip to Taiwan, Nancy Pelosi claimed that China's Xi Jinping was behaving, and I quote, like a scared bully. How does such rhetoric look to further challenge hopes of perhaps rapprochement between Washington and Beijing, do you think?
As you mentioned, Pelosi has certainly continued her very strident remarks on Taiwan since she returned to Washington. There was this line, as you mentioned, about Beijing acting like a scared bully. We also saw more strongly worded statements about Beijing not being able to decide the United States' itineraries. And she also emphasized once more that the United States really needed to make sure that Beijing didn't isolate Taiwan. Whether this view and whether the stridency of this view, I think, is reflected across the United States administration and indeed across the aisle, I think is a separate question. But what I think we can say from the response of China to this trip by Pelosi is that the level of trust between the US and China at the moment is at a significant low point. And I think especially in terms of the level of trust that the US, both Washington and Beijing, have in terms of trusting the other party's actions and words on Taiwan specifically, I think is at a low point, and I think that's where a lot of the worry is for analysts and Taiwanese officials going forward.
Right, and moving forward then, James, Taiwan, for its part, has warned about the potential greater ambitions of China's military drills near Taiwan. Do you care to elaborate?
Sure. Well, what we're really seeing now, I think, is the consequences of that lack of trust really playing out, and how Beijing is trying to reconstitute and redefine what is considered normal intimidatory military behavior towards Taiwan. So just to outline and give some context, prior to Nancy Pelosi's visit, we would see near daily aircraft incursions of the Chinese military, Chinese Air Force into Taiwan's air defense identification zone. However, what we're seeing in the aftermath of this trip is Beijing essentially saying that they're going to look to continue to normalize drills to the east of the median line of the Taiwan Strait. That's the body of water that separates China from Taiwan, and has almost served as a tacit, there's been a tacit agreement between China and Taiwan that this isn't a line that China would cross. And so I think that Beijing is saying that they want to normalize drills east of that, closer to Taiwan, shows that they're trying to ramp up the general sense of militarization that we're seeing in terms of Beijing's actions towards Taiwan. I think this is really the result of the high stature of Pelosi. And I think it put Beijing in a situation where they felt like they couldn't lessen the type of military behavior that they responded with, because they would have worried that would have signaled to the world that their military deterrence when it comes to the question of Taiwan doesn't really have teeth. So this is concerning in a sense, because it's difficult to see where the parties are going to be able to de-escalate from this situation. China really seems to want to ramp up its military intimidatory behavior. We're seeing also drills in the Yellow Sea and Bohai Sea off China's northeastern coast in the coming month. And so, yeah, again, the room for de-escalation amongst all parties seems to be lessening on this front as well.
Right, and my next question is probably going to be a tough one here, James. So what look to be the broader implications of a Chinese offensive against Taiwan, do you think?
Well, in the course of this week where we had these Chinese live fire drills, we already got a taste, I think, of what a worst case scenario would mean for the region. I think Japan is a really good example to bring up here, because China did fire some of these missiles into Japan waters that are part of Japan's exclusive economic zone. And that was the first time, I think, that had happened. And Japan responded very forcefully. And there's some earlier reporting that's suggesting that response from China impacting Japan has led to an increased sense of urgency in Tokyo in just how important the question of Taiwan is going to be for regional security. And I think this is a question that really, we saw it in terms of the increased intimidation in the Taiwan Strait specifically, which, it has to be emphasized, is one of the most important waterways for international trade in the world. If you think, this connects South Korea, it connects Japan, it connects the east coast of China to Southeast Asia and Europe as well. And so I think we started to see amongst international observers and amongst people who weren't necessarily engaged in questions about Taiwan previously, about just how catastrophic, really, any kind of Chinese invasion of Taiwan would be for the regional and global economy.
Right, of course it did. All right, James, thank you so much for the latest with regard to tensions over Taiwan between the US and China.